Welcome back. Our last panel session will consist of all of our previous panel members. The discussions we've had so far have been interesting and provocative, and I'm sure they will lead into a wonderful discussion. Anthony, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks everyone for joining us. Look, it's been a kind of fascinating few hours here. There's so many views to go through. What I've tried to do is take as many of the questions as I could and kind of distill them down into a few core ones to ask the group. And my approach is going to be to put them out there and ideally generate some conversation by putting out a big question and then letting the panelists discuss it. And so what I would suggest is if while I put a question out there, try to be as concise as possible and get your view out there, and then let's have everyone come back in with their thoughts. I'm not going to describe the particular questions that I'm bringing that I've distilled down, but I've tried to take several from the audience here. So one that I would like to start with, because I think it's relevant to what we have all been experiencing in the last week with Afghanistan, is that change in the intelligence community and I would say in general comes about when there is some form of failure. And however you want to look at the situation in Afghanistan, it's clearly it's clearly in many ways disruptive and not the ideal outcome that America wanted. And if you look back even just a little bit further at COVID and what's happened there, again, just massive ramifications for the nation, including in the national security realm. And in both instances, the intelligence community has been brought up in that debate. And I won't give my opinion about whether the intelligence community was at fault or not. And there's arguments to be made on both sides, and those are playing out right now as we speak, and I think will for a long time. But I would put out this question to the panelists: is what can we learn from those situations, COVID and Afghanistan, in the context of previous historical situations like that, such as Pearl Harbor and 9/11? What lessons can we learn towards changing the IC now? And clearly there is a door open right now for change, and there will be some thinking by those within the intelligence community and throughout the government. So what lessons can we learn, and what would you suggest we take away from it? So Samuel, I see your hand up, and if the panelists, either you can just jump in if you see an opening, or feel free to put your hand up and I'll come back and call on you. But I did see Samuel put his hand up first, so I'll go to you first.
Thank you. By the way, Sam is fine.
Oh,
when
sorry.
I hear Samuel, I know I'm in trouble. What I would say is that what we've seen recently is that we'd like the world to present itself in ways in which we have structured ourselves to look at the world. We want to hear things, we want to see things. But we have to ask ourselves, did the situation in Afghanistan present itself in a way that was convenient for the means that we use to collect and analyze the world? And I would submit, going back to 2010, 2011, in the lack of sociological and cultural and anthropological information and understanding leading to intelligence based on those things, we're not structured to receive and analyze that information, so we were unable to derive necessarily useful intelligence from it. Ditto for epidemiological information. We're not structured to see this, only indirectly. We might have said, well, a factory isn't performing as we thought it would, I wonder why. And then said, well, maybe there's an epidemic. But the world didn't present itself, in a way that was convenient for us. It presented itself through, changes in an epidemiological situation, and we're not built for that. So if I were to make a recommendation to the community, I would say before you restructure anything, there should be a searching and rigorous inquiry. How does the world present itself? And then we can ask, what are the best means to understand it? But all I think we need to do right now is to have an honest conversation about how the world presents itself, and whether, and then we can determine if we're organized and resourced correctly to sort ourselves through how the world presents itself.
I saw David, then Greg, then Carmen. Maybe we can go in that order.
Thanks. I agree with what Sam has just said. And honest conversation was, I think, the term Sam used. In 1954, when the news of the fall of Dien Bien Phu reached Paris, Le Figaro newspaper had an editorial, and its conclusion was, "We lied to ourselves." And that ended French colonial adventures in Indochina. But if you read Robert McNamara's, in retrospect, memoir, you will know that exactly the same problem happened in Vietnam and in the early days of the Bosnian War and in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So I don't see what is the last few days as an intelligence failure in the classic sense of an intelligence failure. It is a politico-military failure in which intelligence has a part to play. I mean, maybe we didn't pick up on the private deals that the Taliban was doing with provincial governors in the last few days, before the whole thing imploded. Very hard target, by the way, very hard target. But it's the perennial optimism bias, which leads to flawed reporting from theatre and the inability of those in high command to actually ask the penetrating questions. So we overestimated the effectiveness of the forces we trained in Iraq, fall of Mosul. We overestimated the forces we trained in Afghanistan. We seem to be unable to get a net assessment because that's not the job of an intelligence community. It doesn't do the net part of net assessment. So I think, coming back to our earlier discussion, I would say part of getting this right is bringing the policy community and the intelligence community into private spaces where, with the most senior people, they can have really honest discussions about what is going on without anyone feeling that their brave efforts in theatre are somehow being denigrated by truths being talked to each other.
Great. Greg, you're on mute if you're trying to.
Oh, sorry, no, I just, two comments. First is really embroidering on what David just said. One of the striking features to me of the conversation when I was inside the government about Afghanistan was there was the perennial, and I think pretty familiar, argument between the operators and the intelligence analysts, right? So you had the operators out there thinking they're doing great things and probably doing great things. And then the intelligence analysts always saying, but is it really making a difference? And that argument was mostly friendly, but it was pretty intense, and it ran throughout. The other thing I'd add to, I think David drives sort of political military failure, not so much an intelligence failure. The only thing I'd add there is Sam talked about convenience, and there was a certain convenience to the estimate that the Afghan army could hold on for as much as a year. When after we'd seen Iraq, it seems to me people would have had to say, no, this timetable may be weeks, even days, not a year. So if there was an intelligence failure, it seems to me it was not pushing that possibility front and center hard enough. I think there were some people in the State Department who were saying that, and others, but it seems from what we know now that wasn't front and center in the intelligence appreciation.
Carmen?
want to make two, maybe three very specific points. CIA spent a lot of time and treasure in Afghanistan. It's no accident that the CIA director was there this week. And we probably were as point as anybody in trying to create, build, nurture an Afghan civil society. The very act, how we get involved in this, has more than a whiff of corruption. We pay people if they cooperate with the US. There are contracts out there that are lucrative that you get by closing up with the Americans. So my point is that whole process of nation building using CIA or DOD or state or whoever, very colonial in its heritage. And if you're trying to create a civil society without corruption, it's completely contradictory. The second point I want to make is in terms of intelligence estimates, the fact that the intelligence community has a cumbersome formal process for delivering its points of view gets in the way of flexibility. If you have spent a week or maybe longer hammering out the community view on how long the Afghan army will last, you are not likely to want to change it the next day. And I think the only way we get beyond that is frankly to get rid of the cumbersome formal intelligence process. A lot of people have talked about getting closer to policymakers. I agree.
Yep.
And do something that just creates the ability to be flexible and nimble. What we have now doesn't do it.
Elsa, I see Elsa and then Mim, and why don't you two go, and then I'll go on to the next question. Thanks.
Just raise a quick point or caution perhaps about, I think there's certainly a tendency we've seen in the past couple of months or years or decades even to sort of focus on what is seen as an urgent threat by a conventional understanding of what a threat is. And yeah, not to have our understanding of national security be very aimed and targeted at foreign adversaries, whether they be state or non-state actors. And I think as we start to rethink in the aftermath of this pandemic, what national security truly means to America and to Americans, I think it's a question perhaps meriting a longer conversation. What role can and should the intelligence community play when it comes to sort of continuing to enhance capacity for early warning on pandemics, or with regard to climate change, when we think about the threats that have had the most damaging consequences for our nation in the past couple of years, it's been less sort of the typical priorities or the threats that are seen as most urgent relative to some of these long-term systemic challenges that are less flashy, less urgent, sometimes less dominating the news cycle. And I think it's easier to point to China as a threat, for instance, than to reckon with sort of, as well as some of the threats domestically in terms of right-wing extremism and white supremacist terrorism that we've seen especially come to the forefront of concern. So yeah, I think just the question of how we in the space think about what is a threat, what is a priority, and how do we balance and potentially continue the process of reorienting based on a more holistic understanding of national security. I think that'll be critical to continue to reckon with going forward.
Let's see, to finish up this part of the conversation, and to borrow from the musical Hamilton, I wasn't in the room where it happened. And also, so I'm a little reluctant to judge what worked and what didn't work. But I have been in the room where it's happened in other cases. And even when laying out, the proof that there's a problem, that something needs to be done, and here are courses of action, I have seen a reluctance in leadership of people that have disappointed me to make a decision that seems obvious. So I don't know what happened in these cases. I don't think they should be built, that the changes we're recommending and we all recognize need to be made because they just make sense, should necessarily rely on, what we're seeing in the press about either Afghanistan or COVID. The IC's come forward today and said, look, we can't tell you definitively what happened there. So I just would caution us a little bit about damning the process before we understand the facts, because in the end, it's about leadership making tough decisions, and sometimes they just don't want to do it.
Okay, I have another question. This one is from Dan Flynn, so important for all of us to think about. And he asks, organizations that have previously experienced revolutionary change found that their old ways of measuring their value added or effectiveness no longer applied in the new strategic environment they were facing. Therefore, to adapt to revolutionary change, these organizations had to change the way they measured the value or effectiveness of their outputs. So the question is, how should the IC measure its value add or effectiveness that would indicate it is making progress towards the future environment that the speakers have all discussed today? Sam?
Well, the best way to do it, though the hardest, is to see whether or not good decisions are taken. And we, in the intelligence community, generally we say, well, we don't make policy. We give the best intelligence we can to policymakers and decision makers, and they make policy and they make the decisions. I think that's, I don't want to use again the word convenient, because I think a number of people will come out of their chairs if I do. But in the end, I do think that the intelligence community needs to get closer to policy and decision makers and not allow ourselves the luxury of thinking that we don't bear some responsibility for how intelligence product gets used. If I were to take a look at a couple of current situations, and I'll leave Afghanistan alone. Remember, we're still in the midst of it. And who was it who said in looking at the French Revolution, too early to tell, right? But if we look back at COVID, maybe the intelligence community needs to adjust who its customers are. Maybe it needs to become in some ways more public about what it knows and thinks it knows, so that information is available a little bit more broadly to those who are stakeholders. And we may need to consider an intelligence process that goes beyond the traditional customers to a broader community of stakeholders who have an interest in the decision, as opposed to a more narrowly constrained group. And whether or not we can have an effect on them might be a better measure of how of the success of the intelligence product, the utility of the intelligence product that the community creates.
Ellen?
Thanks, Anthony. So when I was at State, our measure was the number of articles that appeared in the PDB. We were very proud of the measure that of all the all-source agencies per capita, INR provided more articles to the PDB than the other civilian all-source organizations. Is that a valid measure? I don't think so. But I'll tell you a couple other things that we did was I actually brought Jeff Fowler over from CIA, who actually created The Wire, and I had him develop a new content management system that put a focus on pushing our product out at the secret level and lower, but also was embedded with some basic business analytic capabilities that would enable us to sort of see not only when articles are being touched, but when articles are being used, and even parts of articles. Now, that's it's not the best measure, but it's certainly better than saying, hey, we put an article in the PDB, because then we could see who was using it, what parts of it were being used. We provided for comments and commentary. And it was a way to just start getting a sense of, is our intelligence being valued? Interestingly enough, when I started at INR, we didn't have a content management system. And when we looked at our website, we saw the only one that was going to it were people inside INR. So, I mean, these are just baby steps, but there's tons of business analytic tools that are out there that we can incorporate to get a sense of how is our content being used.
Skunk?
Well, at the risk of oversimplification, how about just metrics on results? A product is successful if the retailer reorders it. Your record is successful, it's on the charts and somebody's buying it. That a cure for cancer is working because people survive. This is to address Dan's question. We need we should be much more cognizant of the results. I understand that we've created these huge bureaucracies and nobody wants to fail. And I understand that, but possibly going back and looking at the analyst who had another opinion, looking at if you do the research, you find that there was a group of folks who had a conversation that said, you know what, if we stop all the oil exports to Japan, we tell them that we're going to go beat their ass in China. Maybe the result from that might be that they want to go to war. And there were probably a number of analysts and people who said that, and that's been buried somewhere. To me, it's just going back, again, with the risk of oversimplification, going back and using a set of metrics to find out right or wrong is who had successfully analyzed the situation. And just look at the results. You can beat me up for trying to oversimplify, but there doesn't seem, it seems that we end up diving into, a morass of self-analysis and, bureaucratic, flogging at the mast. And I don't know, it just seems to me to be a huge waste of time. Just look at the results.
Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I actually want to build on that. I think this is a pretty easy question, if you ask me. What's the purpose of national security institutions? What's the purpose of the intelligence community? Well, maybe for the first time in human history, we could try to avoid a massive global conflict that repeats itself, right? So 1945 to 1980 is 35 years. 1980 to 2020 is 40 years. And it sometimes seems like, and this is a quote, I will let the person attribute themselves, but is on this call, that we just seek to play this massive game of risk in perpetuity. Just because. Well, maybe for the first time in human history, we should measure ourselves on, can we continue the experiment of self-government, and can we continue the experiment of individual rights and freedom being the organizing principle of humanity? Because, by the way, feels normal because we've been predominant in power since the end of World War II. It is the anomaly in human history that governments organize themselves around individual freedom. And if we're talking about all these tactical things that the intelligence community needs to do, well, what's the goal? What do you measure it by? Let's measure by a post-scarcity economy where humans on planet Earth are productive. And for the first time, we don't use things like biology, new technology. We don't use it for warfare before we use it for good. We don't use it for weapons, nuclear weapons, before we use it for power. Let's think pretty creatively about how we have a different future than we have repeated as humanity over and over again. And I would say that's the metric I would hold the intelligence community to. Yeah, China and the United States are on a collision course if you look in the rearview mirror. If you're thoughtful and creative about looking forward, it doesn't have to be that way. But we are cycling ourselves right now as a country, and as a global order, we are cycling ourselves into the old tropes of geopolitical competition. We've talked about it, half the conversation today was about multipolar world. Well, that's a IR concept that we've beaten into people's heads for the last 50 years. right? So let's think about it more creatively. And what is the intelligence community's role in creating this future where it doesn't have to be like the past? That would be my very idealistic, I recognize, but hope for how we kind of pursue the next 50 years.
Let's do Itai, David, William, and then Greg, and then we'll move on to the next one. I think that's everyone who had their hands up.
Great, thank you. So I also risk about being a bit oversimplistic. I think it's one of the most, the toughest questions. Again, risking being a bit provocative, I think measurement and metrics are a bit too scientific terms for the art of intelligence in this era. So I would be very cautious at using these two strict terms. I think if we think that we are really in this era of paradigm shift and, adopt the philosophy of Thomas Kuhn, then how do we know that the new paradigm is really efficient? I would suggest, first of all, through the state of where we are in the competition. And the main role, I believe, in competition, I mentioned some of this earlier, first of all, is deterrence, avoiding conflicts, and enabling agility when conflicts arise. You can't measure that. I believe metrics are not really relevant for that. But you can understand if intelligence allows deterrence, allows avoiding conflicts. And if the new paradigm we feel more convenient that it better describes the practice. It allows us better exploitation of data. It allows us better use of machines. So I know this is a rather vague, because really I think it's a very, very tough question. But again, I think based on the net assessment and the state of competition and the way we feel we exploit information and technology, this is the way to understand that this paradigm shift is on the correct term. And one just last issue, we might have to adapt along the way. I believe this is the nature of paradigm shifts. We might have to adapt along the way.
David?
Dan, I spent 7 years as a member of the British Joint Intelligence Committee, trying out method after method for measuring the effectiveness of the community, and they all had significant drawbacks. Goodhearts Law says that picking a measure invalidates its use for policy making because it gets gamed, particularly where resources are at stake. In a way, it's almost paradoxically easier to solve the inverse problem, which is identifying the occasions on which we were unable to support the policymakers in the way in which we perhaps should have done, either because we had the resources in the wrong place or we miscalled it. You learn a lot from that. I don't think you learn a lot from metrics of reports issued or feedback ticks from policymakers saying this was policy relevant or policy determining intelligence, because it all gets gamed in the end. Sounds cynical, but I think it's realistic.
William?
I think I was headed down the same direction as David. I think there's this dog that didn't bark problem in trying to do a blanket assessment of the effectiveness of intelligence products. I think that's why you go to things like, well, how many people downloaded it or how many people read it? I mean, it's a gross indicator, but nevertheless an indicator. I mean, an intelligence product could be highly effective, but as such, maybe policymakers acted on it and you avoided a problem, and that could give a misimpression that the intelligence was wrong. It said this was going to happen, this didn't happen in a very kind of first order, first pass sense. So you're left with cases where you really obviously have some kind of a problem, intelligence failure for want of a better term, or intelligence failings. And so I think case studies have great applicability. I know that case studies, you must be very, very careful at generalizing them. But nevertheless, that's a case where the product didn't work. And so you have some kind of relatively reliable starting point. So that would be my thoughts on that.
Greg?
I just wanted to pick up 2 points. The first is one I think that's been sort of a theme of our conversation, and that is, should intelligence somehow get closer to policy? I've always thought the answer to that question was yes. I think Sherman Kent did us a disservice long ago. They're different roles, but it's the same team. And so that my starting point would be similar to Sam's, that this ought to be done jointly with policy. The second point is really about after action reports or case studies. I think we should do many more of those. What typically happens is there's a failure. My colleague and boss, Jim Clapper, used to say there are only 2 outcomes in Washington: policy successes and intelligence failures. Well, we know that's not true, but we ought to do more after action reports, and not just on failures, because when we do failures, what typically happens is we convene a blue ribbon panel, mostly doesn't know much about the issue because the people that know most are presumed guilty of the failure. They come up with some worthy recommendations that are the sort you would tape on your lampshade, not that have much real bite. If we did serious after action reports routinely, and not just on failures, on successes, then we might begin to notice, as somebody said, is there somebody out there who got this exceptionally right? And can we learn something from that? Or did we do something that seemed actually pretty good? And should we learn something from that? But that would work only if we did it pretty routinely and on so-called successes and not just failures.
Having gone through 3 of these colloquiums now on this topic, I'll say this, that epistemology questions like this keep coming up when we discuss the topic. And for example, the dog that didn't bark issue, and how do we measure such things? And I do think this is going to be figuring out those kinds of issues are going to be key. And I think it was maybe Greg or someone brought it up earlier today in one of the other panels about activity-based intelligence, and you may know the question before the answer before the question, and things like that keep coming up around these issues. And once we get into the artificial intelligence and things like that, it becomes even more prominent. So I think it's a significant area to kind of continue to focus on. A couple of other things that have come up throughout today's panels in a few of the questions from the audience, and then from I think almost all of the panelists have touched on these issues at least a little bit, and they've come up in the previous colloquiums. One is open source intelligence, and I would say the general view that it is getting more important over time and will only grow in terms of the amount of data and information available and importance. The other topic is misinformation and disinformation, which I think most of us consider to be a significant issue now, and also only growing in the future. When you put those 2 topics together, in my mind, it becomes problematic because you're now in a situation where you are more reliant on open source intelligence, yet there is more misinformation and disinformation in that open source material that's out there. And that strikes me as dangerous. So I would put this question out to all the panelists. How do we address that issue? How do we address the fact that we're going to have more open source intelligence, but also at the same time, more disinformation? So I'll go in order as I'm seeing hands go up. Carmen?
I'll just make a factual contribution. So I participated 3 or 4 years ago in the decadal survey for the academies on behavioral and social sciences and their application to national security. And we talked a lot about disinformation and the power of narratives. And what I learned was that academics now, and I'm sure companies, are working on ways of identifying false narratives And you can, back then you could, using AI, not, the naked eye, but using a computer, you could, or machine learning, you could distinguish organic narratives, i.e. a narrative that was emerging naturally in a population versus one that was being contrived and generated. And I think, frankly, not only studying the narratives, but studying the information, but studying the metadata around that information is just going to make you smarter. So I actually, if you have a professional effort, I really don't think this is a difficult problem to solve.
Skunk.
Carmen's right on the money. Talking about strategic messaging, perception management, and perception engineering, there's some pretty specific rules on how to do that. I know there was a European company that hired a company that specializes in disinformation in Europe to create a narrative against vaccination for COVID. The way that messaging is structured, if you understand the principles of it, you have an insight into whether it's, as we say, crap or ice cream. I had the unique opportunity one time to sit down and have dinner with Oleg Kalugin, who has a consulting firm in Washington, D.C. Very interesting man, former deputy director of the KGB. And I said, Oleg, you guys did a hell of a job on the anti-nuclear movement in Europe in the 60s. How the hell did you do that? He said, simple, Skunk. It's real simple. You just take the truth and wrap it in crap. And the trick was always that as you started to peel the onion away, you would find a kernel of truth. And if you're a good analyst, you look at all the crap, you'll peel all the onion away, and you'll find kernels of truth, and that's where you'll find the reality. The same thing is true, I believe, with strategic messaging. I've been involved in strategic messaging for 20 years. It's been a huge piece of this last Shapira war game. As a red teamer, my job is to lie to you and convince you that I'm not lying to you. So I understand the tenets of it. And Carmen, you're right on the money. I think that there needs to be a cadre of people who are well-versed in the perception management world to be able to create a set of metrics to be able to find out whether it's crap or ice cream. But it is very doable. There's no doubt about it. And just one other thing, we live in an interesting world. When Sam had mentioned, what to imagine, we're telling people what to imagine. The day that MTV came online was the day that people were told they don't have to imagine anymore. We'll do it for you. That capability has become so well tuned that, and believe me, they understand the rules of that. When people tell you what to imagine, when people tell you that's a one step away from telling you what to think. But Carmen, you're right. There are rules and there are capabilities to understand how that works. We need to put together the pros and Dover on that one.
Sam?
Thank you. I think it's a good question. Methodologically, there are three things I would suggest. The first is I would take a look at the work of people like Kathleen Carley, who have done a pretty good job, I think, of characterizing, at least in Russia's case, what she calls information maneuvers. That's the first thing I would do. The second thing is I would submit hypothetically, though I don't have enough data to theorize, that disinformation probably does give off signals that, as good as some of it might be, it is not entirely indistinguishable from the truth. Some of us have BS meters that we can use, and I think the intelligence community could develop those tools. And third, I think, as we say, we need more deep depth, which is to say we need people who understand the environments in which we're working. whether it's terrorism or Russia or the situation in Afghanistan or what might be happening in parts of Pakistan or global epidemiological information. It's not just enough to say, well, we'll put somebody in place who sort of confuse these things and put them together and come up with a picture. We need people who understand some of these things so deeply, so richly, with a lifetime of scholarship and analysis, that they also can help distinguish, disinformation and bad information from information that is actually true. And by true, I mean it's both true and it's timely enough to be relevant. Economists use the term almost false, which is to say, to learn something that's true, but after it's lost its ability to help you make a useful decision. I think people who are really deep in the community, in their subject areas, are also pretty good filters for disinformation.
Greg?
Sam is certainly right. Kathleen was on the decadal study that Carmen and I sat on, and her work was very interesting and helpful. I think I'm also in Carmen's camp on this issue. It seems to me this is not exactly a trade-off. I wouldn't pose it that way. It seems to me it's more a trade-on. On the one hand, the community needs to be much better at dealing with open source in general. It needs to have much more focal points. It needs to have much more sharing of best practices. It needs to have much more incubation of interesting ideas. But in that process, it also needs to reach out very much to the private sector that does this as well. And it seems to me that kind of partnership, which is difficult for intelligence, but is so natural in so many ways in this world in front of us. This is an obvious one where there are people out there, the Facebooks and others, who are worrying about this problem as well, and probably a good deal ahead of the intelligence community at this point, that this is seems to me an area that cries out for really very close collaboration with the private sector and people doing this in the private sector.
David, and then Carmen, is your hand up from before, or are you coming back from before? Okay, David, and then Itai, and then I'll go to the next one.
Some quick fire points. First is we need deep specialists in open source, as well as training everyone to look in that direction. But some of it does require a lot of expertise, and we need to train those people up. Secondly, we've got misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, which is information which is true, but was never intended to be public, is stolen and then weaponized and fired back. And the Russians are, we've seen, been particularly good at that. And in future, what we're going to see is deep fakes in text, automatically generated, very difficult to spot, and you can't forensically analyze everything that's coming out. So watch this space, because we will see automatic generation of material designed to inflame passions, whether it's over race or COVID or whatever else it might be. Whose job is it in the intelligence community to defend us against aggressive information warfare directed against us? And it's a bit of FBI, it's a bit of NSA, it's a bit of Cyber Command, it's a bit of CIA. And if you wanted an example to illustrate what we were talking about earlier, of the need to take a mission-centric view rather than a functional view, countering offensive information activity against us is the classic case. Final thought, during the Second World War, it was found that defense lawyers were the best people to craft our own deception narratives, because they are used to taking a given set of facts, agreed set of facts, and weaving a narrative that shows that their client didn't, after all, do it.
I love that about the defense lawyers, by the way. Itai.
Yeah, thank you. Anthony, again, this might echo a little bit from the things you said in the first session. First of all, regarding misinformation, and you might say, intelligence has always had, for example, to validate humans. But this is really a unique phenomenon for the RIA, and I believe really machines and machines that learn in the business, we all know that machines detect anomalies. I believe the misinformation is really a good example of how machines can be used in a revolutionary way to differentiate truth. I know, you know, the Rand Corporation, I believe 2 years ago, coined the term truth decay, which is rather relevant these days, I believe. But I believe a good and revolutionary use of machines can really differentiate between truth and misinformation. And in that sense, I have to provide just, you know, my own perspective about open source, and I'm a huge fan of open source information and open source intelligence. I've even saw the term recent, like research intelligence, because in the open source you have many researchers. I'm a huge fan of open source, but I believe in this revolutionary age, the strength of the open source is whether you use open source as lens to understand the secret and intimate intelligence, and whether to use the intimate intelligence as lens to understand open source. This again goes back to the mission-centric approach I offered earlier. And I think thinking about open source detached from other intelligence, I don't want to say collection analysis, but from other intelligent disciplines, might again miss the revolutionary phase. I believe the revolution is, again, using as lens, vice versa. And this is, I believe, might be, again, a competitive advantage.
Carmen?
Yes, one more point, agree completely, Itai, with everything you said. A lot of the people, I think, who confuse or get concerned about the disinformation open source relationship still think of using open source as an activity of reading, humans reading. I believe 20 years ago that reading was a poor use of my analytic talent. That reading was manual labor. And now I love to read, and now, you know, there's lots of caveats there. But given the wealth of information we have today, it's artificial intelligence and machines that are going to have to do that filtering, and that are going to be make it possible for us to really use open source information in the way Itai described.
So another topic that's come up again and again, or several topics, and it even has come up, I think, by implicitly in this discussion we've been having about misinformation, is the boundary between domestic and international, and therefore the boundary between the intelligence community and other security functions of the government. You call them law enforcement, homeland security. But even more broadly, if you start to see economic competition as being a big part of national security, or as Matt was bringing up, you start to see, in a sense, biological competition as being a part of national security. The boundary's pretty blurry, pretty uncomfortable, I would say, for a lot of us who have come out of the IC, where you're pretty fearful. They really put the fear of worse than God, the fear of regulatory and regulatory authorities in you when it comes to looking domestically. And then when you start to think about economics and getting into the capitalist system, you start to think about now biology and getting into people's healthcare and things like that. It gets really a little scary. But nonetheless, it seems to be, there seem to be a lot of trends here aiming towards that you really won't be able to do intelligence over the next 20 years without at least addressing economic issues, biological issues, and domestic issues in general. So I'll put this out there as the question: how do we handle those boundaries in the intelligence community? How will the IC have to evolve to handle them, either organizationally or through partnerships or by other means, in order to continue to secure the nation against those kinds of threat and competition areas? William? William?
Yep,
You're on
here we
mute.
go. Got it on the second try. I I've actually thought and written about this quite a bit, and I don't reach any good conclusions in terms of the future of privacy. I just don't see, I mean, I hope somebody else does, but I just don't see any way around a more, might call it liberal, but that could be misleading, but you know, less privacy and just more governmental intrusion into various forms of currently protected information in the United States at any rate. And I wish I didn't feel this way, but I do. I know that privacy is deliberately ill-defined, you know, in most cases, and it's not even in the Bill of Rights, really. And we have to roll with it, I think. And it has changed in the past. The concept has changed in the past, and it has to change in the future. But I think that is one tough issue, and one that does have probably a significant downside.
Skunk? There you go.
Yeah. By the way, to Itai's point, somebody's going to make a lot of money inventing toothpaste that you could brush your brain with a toothbrush and prevent tooth decay. I think that's a worthy endeavor. And also, David, on your idea about teaching kids about understanding how to use a computer, when I was asked for input for the national security strategy, I suggested that there would be there should be a mandatory course for K through 12 in cyber hygiene, and all I got was a 60 cycle hum. So I hope somebody else can carry that flag. I was very disappointed. But back to the subject of privacy. The question is, is it imperative that all data be connected personally or to a person? I would posit that a good deal of the data that's necessary to process to reach a conclusion doesn't have to be. And the use of anonymizers, the use of using the data just unconnected to be able to help reach a conclusion is not only possible, but it's already been done. I also agree that the concept of privacy is a fluid and greased pig. But I guess my question to the panel would be, is it always imperative to connect the data to a person? Now, in an anonymizer, when an analytical product comes up based on a certain processing of and analysis of the data, a flag will come up sometimes, and that will identify a person. And I understand that sometimes intelligence has to point to a particular person, but eventually there has to be trust. When we did an analysis of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, the number one conclusion that we came up with when we analyzed it as a work document was justice. Without justice, there isn't anything. And without trust, there is no justice. So the question would be, how do we create a reality of trust, truth, and justice in terms of what's important and what's not important in terms of privacy versus the need of the state? That to me is the fundamental piece. You solve that problem, and then everything else just falls into place. Thanks.
Greg?
I want to come back to the question of the domestic foreign boundary, which I think is really important and really hard. I haven't come to any very general answer about it. My starting point would be that to maybe differentiate a bit among issues. After all, economics has always been thought of as a national security issue, and secretaries of treasury have been on the NSC from time to time. So that one I think is a sort of a natural. It is certainly part of national security. If you're inside intelligence, the hard part about that is not definitional, it's the Treasury, who thinks, the Treasury always thinks it knows better than any intelligence analysts. And so that makes it a particularly hard target inside, much makes the Pentagon look like a cream puff by comparison. Then if you differentiate that from health, going back to our previous conversation, the intelligence community was good at providing grand strategic warning. The global trends mentioned pandemics over and over again, but not tactical warning. That was left to the medical profession. So you could imagine on the DHS model, us creating a Department of Environmental and Health Security with its own intelligence agency. That's probably, given DHS experience, not the right way to go. But it does mean that then you do need to build real better connections between the intelligence agencies and, for instance, CDC. At one point, there was a CDC person seconded to the NIC, and doing much more of that cross-fertilization of people, I think, is probably the best way in the short run. That doesn't solve the even still harder problems about what do you do about law enforcement and intelligence and the privacy issues we were just talking about, but at least breaking it down by issue seems to me a more practical way to go at the question.
David?
Yeah, the approach we've taken in the UK is the idea of the license to operate. So we're in a democracy, so the legislators have to give the license to operate to the intelligence agencies to use these enormously powerful digital tools, including from time to time on our own populations when it's justified, necessary, proportionate, and so on. But the rules for doing that have to be clear to the citizen. And it's a license, and it can be revoked, and it does mean some oversight, not too much, but there has to be trust that the community won't go rogue, as we have done in the past in different ways. So that's the approach. It doesn't mean that the same legal constraints will apply to intelligence activity overseas as it does domestically, but it means that the division between agencies who only see their terrain as domestic or only see their terrain as overseas, that distinction just gets in the way of good intelligence.
Well, Mim?
Let's see. You know, we have this problem in spades today with the cyber threat to critical infrastructure. And, you know, there's a convening of the Titans in the White House today as we speak on that topic. And I don't think there are any good, clean answers, but you can look to models where we've tried to make that work around a particular mission. And the one I always hold up, and a lot of you may be familiar with it, is how effective at information sharing, not necessarily making much of a difference in the flow of drugs into the United States, but the JIAD South, the Joint Interagency Task Force in Key West, that was populated with law enforcement, foreign intelligence analysts, as well as operators, the Coast Guard in particular. And they were all co-located and able to protect their sources, but share the information in a way that allowed for much more facile actions to be taken, and the like. And the intercepts went up dramatically once it got its sea legs, if you will, on operating. So that's one model. There are other things that are being tried with respect to basically sanitizing what people know to be methods in the cyber domain, and then translating that into red teaming for the infrastructure owners so that they understand their vulnerabilities and are provided with some level of solutions. This is going on in the utility sector, but is needed in a very broad way across many more sectors. So I think, to Greg's point, that you're going to have to sit down and see what will work in each particular domain that you're trying to protect. But there's nothing more urgent today, I think, than in the homeland, understanding that our infrastructure is at risk in a very big way, and we got to do something about it.
Thanks for that. We're right up against 5 o'clock. I just wanted to thank everyone who joined on the panel today. Really fascinating views. I learned a lot. And thanks to the audience for joining us. But this is the last of the colloquiums on the topic, and I just wanted to thank the National Academies for putting it on, and Joe and Deanna in particular for organizing everything and allowing me to be a part of it. And thanks to Dan Flynn in the Office of Net Assessments for putting this on. I thought it was extremely important topic. And I hope that we were somewhat helpful to you in your mission, and I'm sure I speak for everybody on the panel here who's spoken in the past. I'm happy to help in any way that you need in the future as you continue to process through the issues. So thank you, appreciate it, and Joe, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, all our panelists. The National Academy sends its warmest regards for your inputs. Thank you. And to our audience, please respond with any comments that you have to our webpage. And we look forward to seeing you again at the next colloquium. Meeting is now adjourned.